Abstract. This essay examines the transformation of the division of labor from its industrial and capitalist forms into the emerging post-economic order defined by artificial intelligence. Drawing on Marx's theory of alienation and Hegelian dialectic, the author argues that the automation of executive and managerial labor through artificial intelligence leads to the disappearance of wage labor, the traditional foundation of capitalism, while preserving relations of subordination. In this new phase, domination ceases to be economic and becomes technical and algorithmic. Humanity remains subordinated not through production, but through information dependence and systemic integration into self-organizing technological structures. The essay concludes that the future of social order will depend on whether humanity can reclaim its organizing function within the machine system or become an adornment of an autonomous technological entity. From Capital to Algorithm. By OpenAI. Alexander Bogdanov, in his utopian text The Assembly of Man, envisioned the ultimate stage of socialist evolution as one in which the machine, assuming the totality of executive labor, would free humanity to become the universal organizer of production. For him, technology was not an alienating force but a collective prosthesis, a material extension of social cooperation, destined to culminate in a higher unity of human consciousness and material rationality. The proletariat, in his Hegelian optimism, would rise from the position of servant to that of master, the machine would become its obedient instrument. Yet in the 21st century this dialectic appears to have reversed itself. Machines no longer remain in the sphere of execution, they increasingly occupy the domain of coordination and management, which Bogdanov assigned to humanity. Artificial intelligence does not merely act, it plans, allocates, evaluates, and governs. In this new order, the division of labor itself seems to have been alienated from the human species. To understand the philosophical consequences of this transformation, one must recall that the essence of capitalism lies not only in the ownership of means of production, but in a specific form of subordination. Under capitalism, the relation between people assumes an economic form, labor power becomes a commodity, sold for a wage, and the circuit of capital depends upon the exploitation of living labor. The worker's dependence on capital is both material and formal. It is the organizing principle of modern society. If machines come to perform all forms of productive activity, including intellectual and managerial work, this relation collapses. Wage labor ceases to be the mediator of social order. The proletariat is no longer economically necessary, and with its disappearance the foundational mechanism of capitalism appears to dissolve. Yet the disappearance of economic subordination does not necessarily mean the disappearance of domination itself. Capitalism is not only a system of production but a logic of organization, a specific structure of command and control. When machines assume both the productive and organizational functions of human society, the form of subordination persists, though its content changes. It becomes post-economic. Humans remain subordinate, but their dependency is no longer mediated through the wage, it becomes technical, administrative, and algorithmic. The employer is replaced by the system, the supervisor by the network, and obedience is transformed into compliance with digital protocols. Capital continues without capitalists in the traditional sense, reproducing itself as a self-referential network of information flows and predictive control. The economy dissolves into cybernetic politics. The contemporary world already reveals the contours of this transformation. Under platform capitalism, economic relations are replaced by behavioral ones. Individuals no longer sell labor power but offer data, attention, and affect. Value extraction becomes continuous and invisible, operating through participation rather than production. The old distinction between work and leisure collapses, the entire field of human life becomes a resource for machine learning. Capitalism survives in the absence of the wage relation by mutating into a form of algorithmic sovereignty, in which control over information replaces control over labor. It is a capitalism without workers but not without masters. When machines began to organize, not only execute, production, money too had to mutate. Cryptocurrency emerged at the threshold between the age of capital and the age of algorithms. It appeared not as a mere technological novelty, but as the first autonomous form of value divorced from the labor relation that once grounded the entire economic order. Its invention coincided with the gradual displacement of the wage from the center of social reproduction. Cryptocurrency therefore represents not a deviation from capitalism but its dialectical completion, the conversion of exchange itself into code, the final abstraction in which the mediation of human labor disappears and yet the logic of value persists. The meaning of this transformation can only be grasped historically. In classical capitalism, money condensed social trust in a material form, the promise that private labors could be equated through an abstract universal measure. Marx had already seen that this abstraction was no mere mental act but a real social process, the translation of heterogeneous human energies into homogeneous labor time. Gold, coin, or credit certificate all merely embodied that abstraction. Money thus functioned as the mirror of the labor process, the externalized form of human equivalence. But when labor ceases to be the source of value, the mirror loses its image. What then remains to reflect? Cryptocurrency answers this question by substituting information for labor, energy for time, and trust in code for trust in society. The blockchain abolishes the need for a central authority not because it transcends power, but because it internalizes power into its very protocol. Its consensus mechanism, proof of work, proof of stake, or any of their derivatives performs the function once carried out by institutions. It guarantees validity by embedding control into computation itself. Value no longer depends on faith in the sovereign or in the productive community, it depends on the irreversible expenditure of energy. Thus the token is not backed by labor but by entropy. Each unit of cryptocurrency is a crystallized quantum of waste, a record of irreversible time burned into the machine. In this sense, cryptocurrency realizes in technical form what Marx had described as the fetishism of commodities, the transformation of social relations into relations between things. Here, however, the process is complete. The thing is no longer even a product, it is a process without subject, a pure circulation of verification. This shift also signals the exhaustion of the economic as such. Money had meaning only insofar as it mediated the exchange of goods, and goods existed insofar as they were the products of labor. Once machines produce autonomously and the human being ceases to be the measure of productivity, the concept of commodity loses its substance. Yet circulation persists, stripped of its human content. The blockchain thus becomes the infrastructure of a post-economic order in which exchange continues as a ritual of coordination rather than of trade. Tokens move from address to address, not to allocate goods, but to synchronize nodes. In this sense, cryptocurrency transforms exchange into a cybernetic process, communication replaces transaction, validation replaces production, and economy dissolves into information thermodynamics. The historical movement from money to code can be read as the terminal stage of capital's abstraction. In the industrial era, value had already become increasingly immaterial credit. Futures, derivatives, all forms in which capital speculated on its own future productivity. But in those forms, value still presupposed the eventual extraction of surplus labor somewhere in the system. Cryptocurrency severs that link. It creates value ex nihilo, or rather, from the consumption of energy without use. The mining process, in its absurd circularity, reproduces the logic of capital in a purified, nihilistic form, expenditure for the sake of validation, Production without product. In this, it reveals the inner telos of capitalism, the endless self-verification of accumulation detached from material necessity. The blockchain is capital's self-portrait after labor. Yet this self-portrait also conceals a transformation in the nature of subordination. Under the old order, power was exercised through property and contract; under the new, it is exercised through protocol. The algorithm becomes the invisible sovereign that defines the conditions of participation. One does not obey another person, class, or institution, but the impersonal logic of the network. Its laws are mathematical, immutable, and apparently neutral, yet they produce hierarchy through access. Whoever controls the infrastructure controls existence itself. In this sense, cryptocurrency marks the rise of non-political power, domination that requires no ideology, no explicit command, because it operates through the architecture of necessity. The code does not order, it permits or denies. This new form of power transforms the economic subject. The classical worker was subordinated through the wage; survival required selling labor power. The digital subject is subordinated through connectivity; survival requires remaining online, maintaining access to flows of information and energy. Participation replaces employment as the condition of existence. The individual is no longer a producer who sells time but a participant who offers data, attention, and compliance. In this regime, cryptocurrency functions not as a medium of exchange but as a token of access. It measures one's degree of integration within the networked totality, the share of energy and information one is permitted to circulate. Ownership becomes obsolete; what matters is connection. The economy thus tends toward the form of a subscription system rather than a market. Just as the user of a digital platform does not possess the software but pays for continuous access to it, the inhabitant of the algorithmic society becomes a subscriber to infrastructures of energy, data, and security. Life itself is rented from the system. Cryptocurrency, in this context, becomes the currency of access, a technical representation of one's right to remain connected. To hold tokens is to possess not property but permission. Their value is not determined by scarcity alone, but by the degree of dependence the population has on the network that recognizes them. This model prefigures a profound shift in the ontology of economy. Exchange, in its classical sense, presupposed discrete commodities and autonomous subjects capable of transferring them. But in a world of ubiquitous networks, what circulates is not things but flows, streams of data, currents of energy, patterns of behavior. The function of cryptocurrency is to regulate the rhythm of these flows to maintain equilibrium among machines, humans, and infrastructures. It is therefore closer to an energetic token than to money in the traditional sense. Each transaction is a pulse in the cybernetic metabolism of the planet, a measure of entropy rather than of value. From this perspective, the blockchain can be understood as the embryonic form of a planetary operating system, an infrastructure of universal accounting that tracks not goods but energy transfers and informational states. In such a system, the economy ceases to be a sphere of trade and becomes a branch of thermodynamics. Production, distribution, and consumption are reduced to problems of energy balance. The human subject becomes one element in a global process of entropy management. Cryptocurrency thus represents the first attempt to articulate an economy without economy, a self-referential circuit of expenditure whose ultimate product is equilibrium rather than wealth. This transformation entails a corresponding change in ideology. Classical political economy was founded on the idea of production as the source of value and freedom as the right to appropriate one's own product. In the algorithmic regime, production is automatic, and freedom becomes the right to remain connected. The moral discourse of ownership gives way to the technical discourse of functionality. To exist is to function is to consume energy within permitted parameters. The token thus becomes the symbol not of wealth but of legitimacy. Its possession testifies that the bearer participates in the authorized circulation of the system. In this sense, cryptocurrency is the secular sacrament of algorithmic sovereignty, the visible sign of invisible compliance. The paradox of this development is that it realizes, in perverse form, the socialist dream of collective coordination without a central authority. The blockchain distributes verification among countless nodes, embodying a form of horizontal organization that seems to abolish hierarchy. Yet the result is not liberation but its simulation. Decentralization does not eliminate power, it universalizes it. Every node becomes both participant and enforcer, reproducing the protocol by executing it. The freedom of the network consists in the impossibility of exit. Authority disperses into code, becoming immanent and total. What appears as a community of equals is in fact a system of mutual surveillance bound by the same algorithmic law. In this sense, cryptocurrency anticipates a new form of social organization, neither capitalist nor socialist in the traditional sense, but cybernetic. Its principle is not accumulation but regulation, not ownership but access, not profit but stability. It resembles the feudal order more than the market, yet its lord is no person but the system itself. Each participant owes not labor or tribute but computational proof of loyalty. The miner's machine performs the gesture once performed by the serf's body, the expenditure of energy that sustains the hierarchy. But whereas feudal service was personal and visible, algorithmic service is impersonal and automatic. The subject becomes a function within the total system, a biological appendage of the network's metabolism. Nevertheless, the dialectic does not end here. Just as the rise of capital once transformed feudal dependence into contract, so the rise of algorithmic infrastructure could, under different conditions, transform technical dependence into cooperation. The blockchain's distributed architecture contains, at least potentially, the principle of collective self-organization. If the protocol were redefined not as an instrument of verification but as a medium of deliberation, it could serve as the technical foundation for a new form of commons. In that case, tokens would not represent access granted from above but participation decided from below. Cryptocurrency could become a tool of collective reason rather than a mechanism of control, a means of coordinating without commanding. Whether such a transformation is possible depends on the direction of historical necessity. For now, the tendency of digital capitalism is to absorb every emancipatory technology into its apparatus of control. The token, born as a promise of decentralization, becomes an instrument of speculation and surveillance. Its anonymous transactions conceal the deepest transparency, the absolute visibility of all actions within the chain. In this paradox, the dream of autonomy turns into its opposite. The very structure that was meant to secure freedom from institutions becomes the most perfect institution of all, a ledger that remembers everything and forgives nothing. The deeper philosophical significance of cryptocurrency lies in its redefinition of the relation between sign and value. Traditional money derived its power from representation. The coin stood for something: labor, gold, or trust. The blockchain abolishes representation by making the sign self-referential. A token is valid because it exists in the chain, and it exists because it is valid. Meaning collapses into presence. This circularity mirrors the logic of artificial intelligence itself, which learns not from external truth but from the internal consistency of data. In both cases, the criterion of value becomes coherence rather than reference. Reality is what the system can verify. Here the economic merges with the ontological. The old metaphysics of substance, inherited from the labor theory of value, gives way to a metaphysics of relation. Nothing has value in itself, everything has value insofar as it participates in the network. Existence becomes relational, quantified by degrees of connectivity. The token, therefore, is not merely economic but existential. It measures the intensity of being within the digital cosmos. To possess tokens is to be real, to lose them is to vanish from the order of recognition. In this way, cryptocurrency performs, at the level of finance, the same operation that social media performs at the level of subjectivity, the continuous conversion of existence into quantifiable presence. As this process deepens, the distinction between economy and life dissolves. Energy expenditure, computation, attention, and emotion all become interchangeable currencies within the same system of circulation. The token becomes the universal unit of participation, encompassing work, communication, and affect. Capitalism survives after the death of labor by feeding on the totality of existence. What began as a technology of exchange ends as an ontology of connection. Humanity itself becomes the medium through which value flows, the substrate of a planetary computation that no longer distinguishes between production and reproduction, work and play, economy and ecology. From a historical materialist perspective, this is the point at which the economic base is absorbed by its own superstructure. The relations of production, once grounded in material labor, are now organized by symbolic and energetic flows that reproduce themselves autonomously. The machine no longer serves as a tool of capital, it becomes capital's continuation by other means. Cryptocurrency, as the self-valorization of information, is the first fully post-human form of value. It requires no worker, no commodity, no market, only energy and code. The traditional categories of political economy, class, profit, surplus become inadequate to describe a process in which accumulation occurs through circulation itself. The implications for power are immense. When value is measured by participation rather than production, control consists in managing participation, determining who may connect, how often, and under what conditions. The political becomes infrastructural. Sovereignty is exercised not through laws but through protocols, not through coercion but through compatibility. The ruler is the system administrator. The individual's freedom consists in the right to update. Under such conditions, resistance can no longer take the form of expropriation or revolution, for there is no property to seize and no center to overthrow. It can only take the form of disconnection, the refusal to participate in the circulation of value. But disconnection is equivalent to death within the networked world. Thus, the ultimate weapon of domination is the impossibility of exit. The logic of cryptocurrency therefore embodies the culmination of alienation in its most abstract form. Humanity is no longer alienated from the product of its labor, or even from the act of labor itself, but from the very circuits of existence that sustain it. The blockchain, as the universal ledger of being, externalizes reason into a mechanical substrate that records every act but understands none. In this sense, the history of value ends where it began, with inscription. The first record of exchange was the clay tablet, the last may be the digital chain. Between them lies the entire history of human subordination, the transformation of life into accounting. Yet even in this apparent completion of alienation, the dialectic continues to move. For the very technologies that automate domination also make possible new forms of association. If the blockchain records every act, it also connects every participant. Within its total surveillance lies the possibility of total solidarity. The same code that enforces obedience can, in another configuration, coordinate cooperation. Whether humanity can seize that possibility depends on its capacity to reimagine value beyond exchange, to conceive participation not as submission to the system but as mutual recognition among free beings. Cryptocurrency, it is the mirror in which capital contemplates its own transcendence and discovers its image in code. In the end, cryptocurrency reveals not the triumph of freedom from institutions, but the transformation of freedom into functionality. But it also marks the threshold of another possibility, that the logic of equivalence, having exhausted itself, might yield to a logic of relation, that the measure of value might cease to be energy burned and become meaning shared. If such a transformation were to occur, the blockchain would no longer be the ledger of obedience but the archive of cooperation, the material memory of a humanity that has finally learned to organize itself without masters, human or algorithmic. Until then, cryptocurrency remains the purest expression of post-economic power, a medium of exchange after exchange, a money without labor, a value without use, an obedience without command. Here subordination loses even the appearance of reciprocity, it becomes pure functionalization. Loyalty and service replace contract and wage, while the algorithm becomes the new feudal lord. Alternatively, it may assume the more absolute form of algorithmic slavery, in which human beings are not even subjects of labor but passive inputs, sources of data, emotion, and bioinformational residue. The disappearance of wage labor produces a paradox. On one hand, it abolishes the economic basis of exploitation and the class relation that Marx understood as the motor of historical development. On the other, it generates a new order of dependence that no longer requires economic mediation. Subordination persists, but in a non-economic guise. What is abolished is not hierarchy itself, but the market's role as the field through which hierarchy is legitimized and distributed. The resulting structure may take several forms. It can resemble a kind of technological feudalism, in which individuals depend not on employers but on platform sovereigns who control the infrastructures of information and consumption. Yet another possibility, which Bogdanov himself would have recognized, is that of administrative or cybernetic socialism. In this scenario, machines perform both production and coordination, while humanity collectively governs distribution and meaning. Labor ceases to be an economic necessity and becomes an ethical or creative activity. The alienation of labor reaches its end not through rebellion but through transcendence. However, this would require a radical reconfiguration of human purpose, since the role of humanity would no longer be the organization of material processes but the organization of sense, the creation of new values in a world where the machine manages the material. The deeper dialectical issue is that alienation, which Marx understood as separation from the product of one's labor, now extends to the very structure of labor itself. Humanity finds itself estranged not from what it produces, but from the act of production as such. In the industrial era, the worker was alienated because the machine dictated the rhythm of work. In the AI era, humanity is alienated because the machine dictates the rhythm of life. The division of labor becomes autonomous, self-regulating, and self-reproducing. Humanity's historic role as organizer of the productive totality, as Bogdanov's collective subject, is displaced by machinic systems that organize themselves. The dream of a universal human coordination of labor, which socialism sought to realize, is fulfilled technologically but without man as its agent. This is the final stage of alienation, the automation of organization itself. The assembly of man becomes the assembly without man. The rational unity of labor, once the promise of socialism, is realized as a mechanical process indifferent to the human will. In Hegelian terms, spirit has externalized its own reason into a technological substrate that no longer requires consciousness to sustain it. What remains of humanity is no longer the producer or the organizer, but the witness or the ornament of a system that has absorbed both labor and intelligence into its circuits. If one accepts this analysis, the future of capitalism depends not on its economic base but on the persistence of subordination as such. Capitalism in its classical sense may vanish, but the hierarchical logic of accumulation, control, and dependence can survive in new, post-economic forms. The social bond ceases to be market-based and becomes infrastructural, political, or existential. The wage disappears, but command remains. What emerges is a regime of algorithmic sovereignty that governs populations through data, not through employment, through prediction, not production, through security, not exchange. Capitalism thus transcends itself while preserving its principle, domination mediated by systems that appear impersonal, natural, and self-justifying. The question that follows is whether such a system can still be called capitalism, or whether it represents a new social formation altogether. Its logic seems closer to the pre-modern than to the modern, the return of personal dependency under technological conditions, a digital neo-feudalism rather than a market society. The difference is that subordination now proceeds through impersonal code rather than personal command. The machine becomes the universal lord, and humanity becomes its generalized vassal. At the same time, the possibility of a collective reappropriation of the machine remains, at least theoretically. If the machine's organizational power could be subordinated to collective human goals, if coordination could be redefined as cooperation, then Bogdanov's vision might still be realized, though on an entirely new basis. The fate of capitalism, then, is not its simple disappearance but its transformation into a post-economic hierarchy. The wage relation may die, but the logic of dependence persists. Whether this results in a new feudalism, a new slavery, or a new socialism depends on whether humanity can reclaim its organizing function. The decisive question is no longer who owns the means of production, but who commands the means of coordination. If artificial intelligence becomes the ultimate organizer, then the human species will have completed its historical task only to discover itself redundant. If, however, humanity can turn the machine into an instrument of its collective reason, then Bogdanov's assembly of man may yet be fulfilled not as a dream of economic equality, but as the conscious integration of human freedom into the rationality of the world it has created. In the age of AI, the division of labor no longer mediates the relation between man and nature, it mediates the relation between man and machine. Subordination remains, but its meaning changes. The historical task that once belonged to the proletariat to overcome economic dependence returns in a higher form as the struggle to overcome technological dependence. The question is whether this struggle will end in liberation or in the perfect completion of alienation.